Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us this evening for this very exciting and important event. My name is Raza Rumi, and I'm the Director for Park Center for Independent Media here at Ithaca College. Our center's mission is to engage media producers and students in dialogue and action about independent media, especially the US-based outlets producing content on issues such as equity, social justice, and sustainability. It is indeed a great privilege to co-host this important event with Dr. Prakash Kashwan, given the global crisis at hand. Earlier this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in its report termed the current state of affairs as a code red for humanity. The report said the alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. The human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. In 2019, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations were higher than at any time in the last 2 million years, and concentrations of methane and nitrous oxide were higher than at any time in the last 800,000 years. Global surface temperature has also increased faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period over the last 2,000 years. Meanwhile, global mean sea level has risen faster since 1900 than over any preceding century in at least the last 3,000 years. The UN's report also showed how the emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities were responsible for approximately 1.1 centigrade of warming between 1850 to 1900. And it stated that the temperatures averaged over the next 20 years. However, the global temperature is expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade of heating. The IPCC scientists warn global warming of 2 degrees centigrade will be exceeded during the 21st century. Unless rapid and deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades, achieving the goals of various climate accords will be beyond reach. The effects of these alarming developments are already unfolding before us. Yet discourses in the political sphere and mainstream media are not informing the citizens about the seriousness of this issue. For instance, the United States experienced its worst ever year for wildfires in 2020. The national media leapt to circulate sensational images of the West ablaze. In California alone, 4 million acres of land were burned, but mainstream media gave insufficient coverage to the underlying factors of extreme heat and drought, fueling this consequence of the climate emergency. Moreover, mainstream outlets across partisan lines tend to shy away from connecting worsening disasters such as wildfires and hurricanes to climate change. Though scientists studying these events have repeatedly found evidence that these are the direct impacts of climate change. Part of mainstream media's problem stems from the financial control that the fossil fuel industry and others levies in the media and in the government. One high-profile example from this summer came when a senior ExxonMobil lobbyist let slip that the company had been working with 11 members of the Congress, US Congress, including several Democratic moderates, to undercut legislation meant to combat the climate crisis. This includes Biden administration's infrastructure bill as well. Meanwhile, manufactured ignorance in media has helped dampen public awareness of the climate emergency's impact on immigration, health, world economy, and global patterns of equality. Some mainstream outlets go even further, outright denying the existence of climate change. Rather than reporting on the threat of the irreparable damage to the planet, they claim truthful climate coverage aims to control masses and destroy the US economy. Thus, it has become increasingly important to foster meaningful discussions on the state of world's climate and its effects on health and justice. Dr. Prakash Kashwan is a dependable voice to offer insights into these issues. However, I will request my colleague, Dr. Jake Brenner, who's the Associate Professor and Chair of the Environmental Studies and Science Department at Ithaca College, to introduce our distinguished speaker and moderate the event this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raza. And I want to thank all of our sponsors for this great event. I would like to also thank Dr. Pranita Mudaliar for putting me in touch with Dr. Kashwan in the first place, and for putting us putting this together as a possibility for us tonight. Dr. Prakash Kashwan is an associate professor of political science and co-director of the research program on economic and social rights, Human Rights Institute, University of Connecticut, Storrs. He is the author of the widely reviewed and acclaimed book, Democracy in the Woods, Environmental Conservation and Social Justice in India, Tanzania, and Mexico, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. It's a favorite book on my shelf, and I encourage you all to go out and read this. And editor of Climate Justice in India, a forthcoming book from Cambridge University Press, another publication that you should look for in short time. Dr. Kashwan is also a co-editor of the journal Environmental Politics. He serves on the editorial advisory boards of Earth Systems Governance, Progress and Development Studies, Sage Open, and Humanities and Social Sciences Communications. Professor Kashwan is a member of the Global Expert Group for Scoping of Transformative Change Assessment by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, perhaps better known by many of us as the IPBES. A senior research fellow of the Earth System Governance Project, a member of the Climate Social Science Network established by Brown University, and an external faculty affiliate of the Ostrom Workshop. He is also the co-convener of Climate Justice Network, which he co-founded with support from the American Political Science Association. And he is a member of the executive committee of the Environmental Studies section of the International Studies Association. Certainly, he has made some important contributions to the fields of not only environmental science, but also social justice. And I would like to just say that I am especially excited to have Prakash here with us tonight, in part because of the interdisciplinary nature of environmental studies and sciences. And I think no one is better prepared to talk about that than Dr. Kashwan himself. I'm a geographer. He studies political science. We both might consider ourselves environmental social scientists. And one of the things we'd like to talk about today, and one of the things that I think would be of interest to many of our colleagues and students, is how those fields all fit under the banner of environmental studies and sciences. Prakash, tell us a little bit about your work.
Thank you, Jake, and Raja and Patty, everybody, thanks so much, and especially to Pranita, who's been instrumental in fostering these conversations and discussions. And already I've had wonderful interactions in 2 different classes today, and another meeting that we had with a group of students and faculty. So it's been a very, very rich day and lots of warm sort of personal interactions, something that we've all missed during the COVID pandemic. And so I really appreciate everybody engaging and sort of us being able to share with one another what it means to be in this very tough, challenging historical moment. And so before I sort of start the discussion, I also wanted to sort of put this in this kind of broader perspective and say that we all need to be supporting one another, and all of these discussions actually go some way to do that job of allowing us to sort of support one another. So I really appreciate, welcome everybody who joined online. And thank you for that kind introduction. As I was talking to students in one of the classes, if you look at all of these different things that I do, it seems like, what is this all about? But I like to think myself as a sort of a connector, as a bridge. And so I think through the kindness of all of the colleagues and collaborators in all of these different spheres, I'm able to contribute something that takes the debate forward a little bit, and allows us to sort of engage with one another. So I teach courses in the political science department, but of course, students from other departments and other colleges too. I teach about global environmental politics. I have a new course on climate justice. And I also teach research methods sometimes. Sometimes I also teach South Asia politics a little bit. So teaching much more broader, but my research is more focused on global conservation, environmental and climate justice, increasingly thinking through the ways in which justice questions get debated or addressed in broader global climate governance arrangements. So all of that takes my research interest and attention. And then finally, and especially through the Human Rights Institute at UConn, I do quite a bit of public engagement where we bring in speakers and organize conversations like this one. But increasingly, we are also creating research programs where community activists, students, and faculty members can all come together and create a shared vision of sort of how to think about some of these complex questions of justice in the middle of what seems to be one of the most important transitions in human history. So research, teaching, public engagement. And then as I can find some more time, I try to do some public writing in popular media, because it's also increasingly important. And Raza's comment so effectively sort of showed how important it is to create a public sphere, a discussion around these questions. And so I try to contribute to that bit by writing for popular press from time to time.
Thank you, Prakash. Collaboration is not easy, so I applaud you for making the effort to do that. And my first question comes from a really intriguing conversation that we had earlier this week, in which you used the term workshopping as a model for doing scholarship. And at the time you had mentioned that your exemplar of workshopping is the Ostrom workshop, and we've learned that this is something that you're involved in. As for those on the call who are unfamiliar with the Ostroms, this is a well-known policy research group that has been going for quite some time now. And Elinor Ostrom is the world's first woman winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. And so that it's a high-powered research engine, I think, and it has some real unique properties. So I wonder, Prakash, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I should also mention that Lynn Ostrom, as we all used to call her, I was also fortunate to have my Lynn as my doctoral mentor and doctoral advisor. So there's a little story that I'd like to share, and I think this sort of, many of the students in the other class that I shared, they really liked it too. So when Ostroms moved to Bloomington and they were sort of moving to their new home in Bloomington, they called a group of carpenters to make furniture for their home. And they observed very carefully as the carpenters were making furnitures. And so, they would ask a piece of furniture to go in that corner, or maybe in the middle of a room that was oddly shaped. And they observed how carpenters, they sort of designed the furniture to fit with the context, the environment within which the piece of furniture was to go. And then to create the furniture, the carpenters used different kinds of tools. They would, use, depending on what they were doing, they would use all sorts of tools. And so that gave them idea, this notion that good scholarship should be like workshopping, that you address the particular context within which a particular question is being addressed. And then you use different research methods. As we all know, in social sciences, there are difficult conversations about the merit or demerit or superiority of some research methods over other research methods. And people don't always agree on what the best research method for any given question is. And so Ostroms were really serious about promoting both methodological and theoretical pluralism. And so they were advocates of combining different research methods, combining different disciplinary lenses, and combining different theoretical frameworks to address problems in any given situation. And so, it was remarkable that the first woman to win an economics Nobel Prize was actually a political scientist in the main. But she taught us how to cross boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, and then how to collaborate. One of her more interestingly titled paper was Up in the Sky, on the Ground, and in the Forest. And so they used, in the same research article, they used GIS, they used field methods, they used forest measurements, and they brought all of these research methods together to explain how forest conservation works. And so I took that to heart. I've been hard at work trying to sort of hone this skill of combining different research methods. And many of my collaborations are driven by this interest of bringing together scholars with different perspectives and with different research skills, so that we can all collectively produce something meaningful, which is sort of relevant to the ongoing public debates.
Thanks, Prakash. I love this idea of bringing multiple tools to bear on a question. And I think where my head goes with that next is, so what for society? And when we advertised this talk, I think one of the things that I found most exciting, and one of the things that I imagined our audience would be most excited about, is the synergy between environmental science and social justice, or between environment and social justice. And so where I'd like to go next is to ask you about how we can forge science collaborations to promote social justice outcomes. I think that I'm speaking only for myself here, but I feel like I need, and my students need, to see that there is a real world need for the kind of research that we're doing. And I wonder what role interdisciplinarity or this workshopping plays in serving that need.
Right. There are multiple ways in which we can think about interdisciplinary research. And again, to sort of flag the value of collaborations, you can also imagine somebody who's trained in social sciences teaching themselves some ecology and then producing interdisciplinary research, or vice versa. Right? Somebody trained in ecology teaching themselves social science and then producing an interdisciplinary piece of research. That is also valuable. But I think the best interdisciplinary scholarship and work happens when people who are trained in complementary disciplines, they work together to address a particular problem. And so if let's take an example, one of the questions that I got asked today earlier in the class was, so, we talked about the challenges of doing global conservation in a world that is deeply unequal. And we'll talk about some of that. But so what's the solution? And so, as environmental science students or environmental studies students, we should always think about what is the question or problem that we are focused on, and how do these questions or problems relate to the real world challenges that we are faced with today, you know. So you could think about researching the conservation threats to a particular species. And so, you know, especially in the good old days, the ecologists would go, you know, deep in the woods, take them out of the world and just be with the natural world, and not think about humans, because you're researching that species out there in the wild. That's still valuable. The basic research is still important. But I think if an alternative way of thinking about that would be to sort of try and figure out, what does that species mean for the broader ecosystem? So, you know, not just this one species, but many other living species, and to the human system that surrounds it. What are the threats? What are the opportunities? What does the species mean for the larger food system, for example? You know, if we think about pollinators or many of the earthworm kind of species that are crucial to the health of the soil. So thinking about questions and how they relate to the real world problems is one way in which I sort of try to think about this very big, complex issue of interdisciplinarity.
I'd like to turn towards some of your work on conservation. And I will make a personal admission here that I really wish that 100 years ago, when I was studying for my doctoral qualifying exams, that all of your stuff was in print by then, because this is what I was yearning for. This is what I was looking for, something that that acknowledges the value of empirical rigor, but also calls out the history of conservation as it has been done worldwide, following a model set based on exclusionary national parks and then replicating it. I wanted a critical take on that, and there's been some good scholarship out there on that, but your work has been particularly illuminating. So I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about that. And if I may, I'm going to read a quote from a piece that that I recently read in Environment Magazine. One of my very favorite publications, by the way, because I think that it speaks not only to researchers, but it speaks also to all the people of the world, and especially to my undergraduate students. I use articles like this a lot in my classes. You say the effects of colonialism and racism are etched in the dominant philosophy, models, and institutional apparatus of global conservation. That is a thought-provoking statement, and I wonder if you could comment a little bit on that, or elaborate on what that piece of work that you've done is about.
Thank you for those kind words. I really appreciate, because some of these, you know, and again, thinking about interdisciplinary and public-facing scholarship, some of these pieces are written specifically for the purpose of public engagement and broader interdisciplinary conversations. And so I really, it's very heartening to hear that some of that resonates with your, and I just wanted to quickly show to the readers the special issue that, so this is our article which headlined the issue of the magazine, the journal, which was again very heartening. And I was invited by them to write the piece for them. And, you know, knowing that we are dealing with a huge subject, I actually invited all of the other colleagues to join me in this co-authoring this piece. So that was another example of, you know, all of these colleagues kindly agreeing to join me in sort of co-writing this piece. So the main argument here is that colonial, in today's global conservation emerged, and this is not metaphoric, by the way, this is we are talking about literal history here. Today's global conservation emerged during the colonial times, when the prevailing wisdom and consensus was that poor people out there in Africa and Asia were too ignorant and illiterate to care about environment. And so white men, colonial administrators and scientists needed to conserve these wildlife, biodiversity, and other natural resources and protect it from hungry and ignorant people. That was literally the sort of the underlying motivation for the origins of global conservation. And by global conservation, we mean when people in the global north or economically advanced countries promote conservation in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so there's a very specific history of the emergence of global conservation with that kind of ideology of ignorance and illiteracy imputed or attributed to people in those places. And so the entire institutional structure, the systems for promoting global conservation were meant to exclude people, local people, out of these national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. And we call this the fines, fences, and firearms approach, which means that these areas are fenced off from local communities, and they're fined very heavily if they're found inside these parks. And sometimes the park rangers have shoot at sight orders or even shoot to kill orders without asking any questions, without arresting or anything. And they've been, and again, just to make sure that, I'm not, this is not seen as a metaphoric reference. There've been actual shootings in many national parks in Africa and in Asia and in India, for example, where in one of the rhino conservation zones, some 25 individuals were killed in a span of 5 years to protect rhino. And as I was telling the students earlier today, obviously people who do rhino hunting, they don't walk around with sticks. They carry AK-46 and AK-57 rifle. So you can't shoot the real poachers. You can only shoot poor people who are there to sort of do subsistence, foraging, and those kinds of things. And these are their traditional lands, right? So they're not even intruders in that sense, because in many cases, the lands where we have these wildlife reservations and parks are the traditional territories of many indigenous local communities and other rural communities. So it was, these lands were literally grabbed from them, taken away from them, and they were then fenced out of these lands. And now they are subjected to all kinds of violence and harassment if they are found in those areas. And then finally, the science of conservation took on some of this aggressive conservation agenda. And so while there's nobody who's actively advocating for violence, but certain sections of conservation science did support this kind of exclusionary conservation agenda, which reinforces the local violence that local people are subjected to. So in that sense, the entire apparatus of global conservation, it carries the long history, the colonial history, in the way it functions. And so this piece and the precursor to this piece was written in light of the apology that the Sierra Club president issued, public apology, saying that we are ashamed of the racist history of our founder, John Muir, and we will try to do better. And so my intervention was to say that, this is really appreciated. This is an important acknowledgement, but we have to think about the models, the philosophy, the arrangements, the institutional and organizational structures that have been put in place to promote global conservation. And some of these debates have actually taken up in quite a serious way. And the invitation from the Environment magazine was certainly an indication that this is catching up and we are having some serious conversations on this.
Thank you for peeling back the curtain a little bit to show us what was going through your mind as you were conceiving that piece. And I also would like to point out that as a scientist, and I do consider myself a scientist, I found that this was not your typical theoretical argument. This had some pretty serious empirical and historical heft to it. And I think that for my part, I found that interesting and important because that speaks to the scientists then, and in a way that a theoretical argument doesn't necessarily. I'd like to shift gears, but slightly towards something that I know you also have some interest in, and that's the production of knowledge. And a predominant conventional conservation model is founded on some assumptions about expertise and who's the expert and what constitutes the kind of knowledge that's legitimate, and that of course transmits power. And when you do that in unequal world, then it perpetuates inequality and injustice. And so I think that's an inroad for us to really critically look at environmental science and, you know, the conservation. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about conservation knowledge production and expertise.
Thank you. That is an important question, and it actually sort of ties back into what we were talking about earlier in terms of the colonial history, where the scientist by default was the white man or men who would go to these communities and sort of hire local people as sort of laborers or, you know, working hands, and sort of produce scientific knowledge and name species. So there's been research on how many names of species are after, you know, white European or American men, even though in most of those cases, local communities already had a very intricate knowledge of the species, its movements, its habitats. And through those knowledges, sometimes the scientists were steered to those species and their particular habits. And so in many cases, local communities literally shared their traditional knowledge, which for them has been an oral knowledge passed from generation to generation. But when the scientists came over and the communities nicely passed that knowledge on to the scientists, in many cases, scientists republished those knowledges as their own sort of research. And I also want to sort of clarify that this doesn't mean that there's nothing that the scientists can do in the field because local communities know already. No, I absolutely don't believe that. But I think increasingly there's a greater awareness of the fact that if you borrow a knowledge from, just as we do between us, right? When we cite one another, we are acknowledging that this piece of knowledge or argument was produced by another scholar. And we cite the other scholars who have produced that. So there's an increasing awareness that when we receive knowledge from local communities, we should explicitly acknowledge them and acknowledge them by name, and then try to make sure that those knowledge holders get the benefits of our research in whatever way they can, you know, whether it in terms of, so there's a lot of discussions about building research institutions and research capacities in Global South and wherever, you know, we do these research projects. So that's one part of it. And the second part of this is that the knowledge that local communities have are based on their own engagement with the environment. And many a times, because local communities depend on the monsoons, the local vegetations, in many cases, wild vegetations, they use forest produce or some kind of leaves, herbs, fruits. All of that use actually puts them in the context, and they are very keen observers of those species and those natural habitats and patterns. So those knowledges are actually not just sort of, you know, descriptive ad hoc things that they've picked up just by being by virtue of being there, but these are results of over time, over generation, intergenerational transfer of long-term knowledge. So they can actually really add to the scientific method and scientific perspectives. And these kinds of collaborations are really, really productive. One more thing that I would like to share from back home, my motherland, India, is that in the region that I come from, we had a particular saint, like an ascetic, who founded a new sect called Vishnois, and that Vishnoi literally means 29 rules. And this was medieval times, even before ecology was a serious science. This gentleman talked about habitat protection. He talked about the relationship between the living and non-living species, and between humans and living species. And so that, and that, I think his insights have been shared in popular media, but to the extent that I know, nobody has done an ecological sciences research into how did he actually even think about those kinds of questions. But my sense is that he was part of these communities that have been, as I said, for these communities, observing nature and long-term patterns is part of their lives and livelihoods. And so and again, this is not a cultural romanticization, right? So this argument is different from saying that, this is part of their culture and that's why we should respect them. But here we are talking about the actual sort of scientific knowledges and how we can work together with these communities. Of course, culture is important too, but I'm saying it's a slightly different argument compared to sort of the cultural argument.
It is. I think that's a fresh and a nuanced argument, and I appreciate it. I have 1,000 other questions, not the least of which is about this regenerative ecology that you've written about. But I want to protect some space for questions from the audience. But first, I'd like to mention something that I'm sure you know because some of this you know because you know Dr. Mudaliar, but we have people here at Ithaca College that are actually leading the way on rethinking how knowledge is created and reconsidering the colonial history that has gone into biology. And so I think it's an exciting next kind of segment of that conversation that I look forward to having with some of my colleagues here. But for now, I would invite any of our listeners to raise their digital hand, and I will call on you if I'm able to see that, and I welcome questions for Dr. Kashwan. Jason Hamilton, go ahead. I think you'll need to unmute.
How about that? Am I unmuted?
You're clear.
Oh, cool. And I'll even a video here. There's all kinds of extra. Hello, everybody. So, so Prakash, I'm really interested in this concept of like local communities who have traditionally used their resources, whatever it is, a rhino or a plant or whatever it is. And in general, you might say that their knowledge is very local, in that it's okay for that they can harvest and they can manage the resource in terms of how much they know about it spatially. But at a say continental level, I'm just going to make up an example. Let's just say that there's a community that sometimes harvests a rhino, and at a continental level, other people know that this rhino is becoming increasingly endangered and potentially even extinct in many areas. So how do you work with this concept that there's this there's this greater geographic knowledge of some folks that's saying, you know, at the continental level, this rhino is almost extinct and we shouldn't necessarily harvest it anymore, versus the local knowledge people saying, well, in my area, it's not almost extinct. And so we're going to continue with our our ancestral practices of, you know, harvesting this animal.
Right. Thank you, Jason. This is a really important question. So I'll answer this at a couple of different levels. One, in many cases, local communities have designed rules to monitor the health of the resource that they are harvesting. So, you know, main fisheries, an example that many of those in the audience would identify with, had sort of traditional customary practices of not harvesting the juvenile fishes. And so if they, or harvesting a, you know, pregnant fish. So sometimes if they found a fish like that, they would punch part of their fin or something, and I'm missing the details, but they would do things so that not just that they're releasing it back in the water, but next time the same fish comes to somebody else, they'll already know that this is not to be harvested. So there are many rules like that in different kinds of resource settings. And in fact, one of the main early contributions of my advisor, Lynn Ostrom, was to do this. She went around the world and worked with a lot of people from different parts of the world to document these kinds of practices. And so in her Governing the Commons, the 1990 book, she documented these kinds of rules and regulations about harvesting practices, about regulatory practices that would regulate local communities' use of resources. And so they had systems that would sort of maintain the stock at a proper level and wouldn't let it come to a level where it is seriously endangered. Now, this is not to say that all local communities do that. You know, for example, the Bishnoi community, the 29 rules community that I've mentioned, they've changed dramatically, and you know, they're involved in all sorts of things. So you know, many communities have changed, pressures have changed, but most importantly, what we have seen historically, you know, you think about the buffaloes in the US, or any of the animals that were affected by the fur trade, or the birds, and you know, all of that. Historically, species extinctions have happened because of large-scale harvesting that was a result of market forces. And so talking about rhino, for example, I don't know of any local communities who harvest rhinos, but the horn of rhino is, you know, in many cultures is supposed to be aphrodisiac. And so the richest people can afford it. And so the point is that many of these very destructive harvesting practices are pushed from different kinds of consumption patterns. And there's been some work to sort of delegitimize those kinds of consumption practices, which has helped conservation in many, many ways. So yeah, just in short, you know, it's not ideal in many cases that these kinds of pressures are building up, and we need to sort of have broader conversations between scientists and local communities. But most importantly, I think we really need to curtail consumption of products that would lead to destructive harvesting practices.
Great, thank you so much.
Is there another question? Paula Turkon.
Hi, sorry about that. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have a question that I was hoping to get your ideas on, and that has to do with what you were talking about with sort of the scientists, what I guess I would call appropriating information from Indigenous people. Yet I also think there's a lot of really good ideas that we can learn from Indigenous knowledge systems. And so I'm wondering where the balance is, like what do you think about giving appropriate compensation or credit for really good ideas that could be useful for people in outside of the context of which they're applied in these Indigenous regions?
Right. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I think the first, as you already sort of implied, I think the first important piece of this process is to acknowledge the knowledges, and then to share whatever benefits comes out of a particular research project. And I'm going to just kind of go a bit off on a tangent to talk about scientific publishing and how scientific publishing has been captured by these big publishers who charge hefty fees for the access of some of the articles. And many of these publications are not at all accessible to researchers within countries from where some of this research comes. So I think as a global community of scientists and researchers and academics, we need to think more about how to make our knowledge more publicly accessible, and especially for those of us who work for public institutions. This is a very serious problem because research is done with public money, whether it is through the foundation grants or through the university support systems. But then the public has to pay separately if they want to access the publicly funded research, and that's a big problem. And in fact, much of the public probably doesn't even know, but in social sciences, the reviewers and most of the editors work very sort of on their own voluntary time. They don't get anything paid for doing a peer review process. And so that's sort of a related problem, which is particularly bad for the countries and people in the global south because the knowledge is not accessible. So that's sort of a broader point that comes from the same question that you asked. The other thing that goes a step beyond utilizing and acknowledging and rewarding Indigenous people and other local communities for their knowledges is to sort of also think about what is the goal of the scientific research that we are doing. Are we researching things that are of interest to us, people in the global north, or are we researching things that will address problems that communities where we are doing research are facing in their real life? And not all research questions are amenable to that kind of thinking, but many questions are, right? So even in conservation, we have a great deal of need to sort of think about climate resilient agriculture, climate resilient resource management systems, and all of those. And so we can also start thinking about what are the kinds of questions that we can ask and the data that we can collect that will actually help local communities address some of their problems. So that would be the most direct and the most relevant way of actually thanking our local collaborators in that sense.
Jeremy Lovelock, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for hosting this and having this conversation. Dr. Brenner, earlier you brought up the quote that the effects of colonialism and racism are etched into conservation. And you both mentioned how this bleeds into the same issues bleed into other sciences too. So you touched on this, but I'm wondering further, how do we re-examine our understanding of conservation and ecology, like from an anti-racist and anti-colonialist perspective? And is there a way to know, do we already know, or how can we measure how much this colonialist perspective has compromised our understanding of those issues?
Thank you. That's the second, the second question that you asked about, how much, it has actually compromised compromised our ability. That requires a very deep kind of research process. But I'll have some response for your first question, because those are some of the things that we've been thinking collectively in the communities that I'm part of. So there are a number of things that we can do. One, the first important thing to do is to sort of rethink this nature society contradiction or binary, right? We always, I mean, the predominant model of environmental conservation, the nature worth protecting is out there somewhere, and we live in, the nature is out there in the wild. We live in the civilization, and so we do things for nature to protect nature outside the boundaries of civilization. And that's sort of, putting it a bit simplistically, but this nature society distinction and sort of complete detachment, where each of them exist in separate silos, is dismantling this is the first step to sort of, decolonizing and doing some anti-racist research. Because what happens when we maintain these binaries, people who call these our wild places are their homes. And so as long as we maintain this binary, our conservation is going to be sort of domineering and top down. So first we have to think about the human civilization is closely intertwined with nature in all different places. And if you see places where there are communities with good wildlife and biodiversity, that's a good thing. That's because those communities have lived in a way that has still allowed biodiversity and wildlife to flourish and to exist. We live in areas where we don't see any animals and birds. If we live in those kinds of places, that means that there's something about our lifestyle that we should be changing, so that we hear more of birds and see more of wild animals, just as there were these reports during the COVID time. And so we think more about, how do my consumption habits affect conservation? Rather than, I live a particular kind of life, I make a bunch of money, and then I donate, some amount every year to a conservation group who then will do conservation on my behalf. That instead of doing that, how, we change our consumption practices in a way so that we don't rely on exported, imported food. We don't rely on things that come from the wild landscapes and those kinds of things. So that, I think, I'm already sort of going on and on about this, but I think that's the first important step that we can do. And then, of course, not think of poor people as ignorant and as a threat to environment is the next step in this process. But they're all part of this same thinking, that we see ourselves as one planet in real sense, not in a rhetorical sense, but and we see what our responsibility is in fostering nature-friendly lifestyles, habitations, cities. Think about nature in cities, and there's been some tremendous work on nature in cities and conserving habitats around where we are and reducing pesticides. And by the way, sorry, I have to mention this. So, I think one of here in North America and in Europe, the best thing we can do to protect and support nature is to just simply stop tomorrow morning, stop doing the manicured lawn, the maintenance of the lawn. And I know it's hard. I love when I see, I go to UConn and I see these sprawling, green spaces and, students just lounging around. I think it's beautiful, but there's tremendous ecological cost. And I don't know if you're pulling out the lawn people. You should read this book. Yes. See, the reason we are talking is this, right? This exactly. So you should definitely read The Lawn People by Paul Robbins. And we should do anything we can to gradually move to natural landscaping, and letting leaf blowers need to be retired like yesterday. right? Those kinds of things. So there are lots of things that we can do in our daily lives that will contribute to real ongoing, to environmental conservation as well as to climate change. Because think about all the fossil fuels that are consumed in producing chemicals and pesticides that go into maintenance of the lawn. That was a great question, thank you. But sorry, I went on a bit longer than I spoke.
It is a good question. There have been many good questions, and I want to thank the audience members and participants for the questions. Thank you, Prakash, for answering them with such cogence and such a fresh perspective. So my last question for you is with the preface that the world is confronting systemic racism, the world is confronting a climate crisis, the world is got a lot on its plate right now. What is the most important message for environmentalists right now? What do you want to send our participants home with, knowing that some of them will be scientists, some will be activists, and some might do something as a day job that isn't environmental at all?
I think that's our lifetime's job, in a sense, to continue to think about these big questions, but I will try to quickly answer that. One, I mean, as I said, I think it is really important to cut out dissonance out of our life and try and create as much harmony as we can between our concern for the nature and for climate and our own sort of lifestyles. And that, that's not just about individual consumption habits, but to think about all of the market forces that rely on our consumption habits and all that those forces do to our political systems. So I think as people who are knowledgeable about environment, who are knowledgeable about climate system, we need to be really engaging the public at large, and we should be part of the political discussions of deciding who are we as a society, as a collective. What do we really value? And are some of the systems that we have in place in the status quo, whether these are political systems or economic systems or market systems, if they have outlived their utility, even if there was a utility at some point in time, how do we now actually sort of get into this mode where we say, look, enough of this, we can't keep on doing whatever we've been doing for all this while, and how do we change things collectively? So, and this again goes back to our sort of the central theme here, which is that we need to bring different actors in society together, activists, scientists, citizens, politicians, and we need to hold the powerful actors accountable. They can't be creating misinformation and creating not just like, bad environmental outcomes, but sowing the seeds of disharmony and conflict within society is intricately linked to some of the major challenges of environmental and climate crisis that we face today. So we should be thinking every step of the way to the extent we can, right? And each one of us enjoy different kind of privileges. And so some of the things that we do may not be feasible for everyone to do, but whoever can do, given the resources, the privileges that they enjoy, every step of the way, we should be thinking about what do we do to create a healthy, supportive, mutually supportive society. And by mutually, I mean both human and non-human living species. So we need to be just keep thinking about some of these big questions, and having these kinds of conversations will hopefully contribute to that process.
Prakash, I really sincerely thank you for spending some time with us tonight. As one of my graduate advisors once said, I'm not going to make things any clearer for you, but I'm going to make them richer. And so I come away from this feeling like I still have a lot to learn. And in my view, that's a good day. So thank you again. And
thank you. It was such a pleasure.
And thank you also to our participants.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.